Most people encounter the number 7 in Scripture and treat it like a curiosity, an interesting pattern worth a moment of acknowledgement, and then you move on. 7 days of creation. 7 seals and revelation. 7 churches. 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets around Jericho. You note it, you nod at it, and somewhere in the back of your mind it registers as biblical symbolism, which is often how we describe things that feel meaningful but that we haven't quite slowed down enough to understand. This script is an attempt to slow down, because what becomes apparent when you actually sit with the frequency of 7 in Scripture, not just counting its appearances but asking why it keeps showing up in places as different as a creation poem, a military march, a prophetic vision, and a genealogy, is that the number is doing something consistent. Across wildly different genres, different centuries, different authors, different audiences, something consistent is happening. And the question worth exploring isn't simply what that something is. It's what it reveals about the mind behind the text. The most immediate entry point is language itself. In ancient Hebrew, the word for 7 is sheva. And sheva shares a root with 2 other concepts: the idea of an oath and the idea of being full or satisfied. These are not 3 separate ideas that happen to share letters. In the Hebrew worldview, language and reality were not as neatly separated as they tend to be in modern thought. Words carried the weight of the things they described. So when you said sheva, 7, you were not just counting. You were evoking completeness, and you were evoking covenant. This linguistic overlap matters enormously for how the number is used throughout the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 21, verse 28, Abraham separates 7 ewe lambs before witnessing a covenant with Abimelech. The animals don't just accompany the agreement. They are the agreement, formally sealed through the language embedded in their number. The location is afterward called Beersheba, which carries that same root, that same weight, the well of the 7, the well of the oath. The covenant and the number were inseparable because the language made them inseparable. Once you hear that, you start reading the text differently. The 7 days of creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are not simply a description of how long things took. They are a covenant document. They are God signing creation with the same number that sealed promises, saying, in the grammar of the ancient world, "This is complete, this is mine, and I am bound to it." The 7th day in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 is not just a day of rest. It is the covenant seal on everything that came before it. And the fact that it is blessed and set apart, the Hebrew word kadosh, meaning consecrated, designated as different, makes it not just a pause but a declaration. What preceded it was whole. The 7 confirmed it. This framing does something interesting to some of the more puzzling stories in Scripture. Naaman's 7 dips in the Jordan in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 14 have been interpreted 100 ways, as a metaphor for humility, as a test of obedience, as a demonstration of prophetic authority. All of those readings have merit. But the 7 is doing something additional. Naaman doesn't arrive at healing through gradual improvement across 7 attempts. The text is clear. The restoration happens on the 7th immersion. The healing waits for the full number, for the complete covenant moment. What that communicates, if you read the 7s as covenant language, is that grace in this text doesn't operate like a vending machine that dispenses a little at each button press. It arrives when the full form of trust has been reached, when the shape that covenant faithfulness takes in that moment has been completed. Naaman's problem, his almost failure, was that he wanted to manage the terms. He wanted a dramatic gesture from Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 11, a wave of the hand, a prayer, something he could see. The 7 dips in an ordinary river felt too plain, too unceremonious, too beneath his rank. His officers had to talk him back from leaving in verse 13. He nearly missed his healing because he was negotiating with the symbol rather than trusting what it represented. That is, if you think about it, a remarkably honest portrait of how people relate to divine instruction across cultures and centuries. We don't resist what we can't understand nearly as much as we resist what seems too simple for how significant we feel the moment to be. The pattern of Elijah's servant scanning the horizon 7 times in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 43 carries the same structure, and the same emotional texture. 6 reports of nothing. 6 returns with empty hands. And on the 7th report, a cloud the size of a man's hand. The breakthrough arrives not at the 3rd try, not when Elijah's patience runs thin, not when the narrative feels ready for a resolution. It arrives at the completion of the full cycle. Some scholars have noted that this repeated back and forth almost reads as tedious. That's intentional. The text is not dramatizing the wait, it's preserving it. Because the point is not that 7 is a lucky number. The point is that divine purposes arrive when they are complete, not when we are ready, not when the pacing feels right to a human reader, and not one dip or one servant's report before the appointed fullness. The Sabbath year, what Leviticus chapter 25, verse 4 calls the Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, extends the logic of 7 outward from days into years. The land itself was to rest every 7th year. Not the people alone, not the worship calendar alone, but the ground, the fields, the vineyards. Every 7 years, the agricultural system that sustained life was to be released from human management for one full cycle. And then in verse 8, the count continues. 7 sets of 7 years, 49 years, leading to the 50th, the Jubilee. The year of release, the year debts were forgiven, land was returned, indentured servants were freed. The entire economic and social structure of Israel was designed to reset at the fulfillment of the 7th seven. This is perhaps the most structurally ambitious use of the number in the entire Hebrew Bible. The covenant logic of 7 is not simply applied to a single event or ritual. It is embedded into the architecture of time itself, into how society organizes labor, land, debt, and freedom. The number 7 is not a symbol layered onto the social order. It is the social order's foundation. Rest and release are built into its mathematics. There is a strand of interpretation, worth examining rather than dismissing, that reads the prophetic literature of Daniel through the same lens. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 introduces 70 weeks, which the original Hebrew renders as 77s. The passage is one of the most debated in the entire canon. Different traditions, different theological frameworks, different understandings of what the 77s refer to historically. But across those differences, most careful readers agree on this: the structure is not incidental. 77s, 7 multiplied outward by 10 and then multiplied again, is a statement about a span of time that belongs fully to divine purpose. The number is a covenant boundary, not a calendar deadline. Jesus uses the same multiplication in Matthew chapter 18, verse 22 when Peter asks about forgiveness. 7 times? Jesus responds, 70 times 7. The rabbis in first-century Palestine had traditions about forgiving 3 times, 7 times being considered an exceptional and generous upper limit. Jesus does not correct the number 7. He detonates its ceiling. He takes the language of covenant completeness and opens it outward past any point where arithmetic could follow. Forgiveness, in this framing, is not a quantity you manage. It is a posture you inhabit. The book of Revelation is an entirely different kind of document from Genesis or 1 Kings, but the logic of 7 runs through it with even greater density. 7 churches, 7 lampstands, 7 stars, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. Scholars who count carefully find more than 50 explicit uses of the number across the book's 22 chapters. It would be a misreading to approach all of this as a coded sequence, as if the 7 seals in Revelation chapter 5 are 7 scheduled events to be matched against a news cycle. The more consistent interpretation across traditions that disagree sharply about other matters is that 7 in Revelation means what it means everywhere else: totality, completeness, the full scope of divine action in history. The 7 churches are not 7 congregations out of many, they are 7 as a complete representation of the whole church in all its diversity and struggle. The 7 seals are not 7 appointments. They are the entire arc of divine sovereignty over history, unveiled in its fullness. One observation that tends to get less attention in these conversations is the relationship between 6 and 7. 6 is the number of human creation. Humanity is made on the 6th day in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 31. 6 days of work. 6, in the architecture of the creation narrative, is the number of what humans do, what humans build, what humans are responsible for. There is nothing wrong with 6. It is the fullness of human effort and human dignity. But 6 without 7 is striving without arrival. It is labor without rest, purpose without consecration, creativity without covenant. Ancient Jewish commentary recognized this rhythm and built it into their understanding of Sabbath, that the 7th day doesn't just conclude the week, it sanctifies everything that preceded it retroactively. The work of 6 days only becomes holy in relation to the rest of the 7th, which is, if you sit with it, a quietly profound observation about how human effort relates to divine meaning. The things people build and make and contribute, their 6 days, do not become fully what they are meant to be without the 7th. Without the moment of release, of rest, of consecration. Not because the work lacks value but because completeness requires more than output. The 3 6s of Revelation chapter 13, verse 18 are loaded with this theology. Not evil in an arbitrary or dramatic sense. Theologically precise, human systems tripled and echoing, striving, reaching, building, but perpetually arriving at 6. Always one short of the rest that would make it whole. What the number 7 reveals, read carefully across the breadth of Scripture, is less a mystical code than a consistent theological grammar. A grammar that says, divine purposes complete what they begin. That covenants are binding in both directions. That the full measure, the 7th dip, the 7th report, the 7th year, the 7th seal, these are not arbitrary endpoints. They are the arrival points of faithfulness. And perhaps the most honest thing to say about all of this is that it resists being turned into a formula. The 7s don't work because performing 7 of something triggers a response. They work, or rather they mean, because they are the shape that completeness takes in a world where the God being described is one who finishes what is started, who keeps what is sworn, who rests not from exhaustion, but as a declaration that something is whole. Whether that reads as theology, as ancient literary architecture, or simply as a pattern worth noticing, the 7s keep asking the same question to every reader who slows down long enough to hear it. Not, what is the magic in the number? But, what kind of God signs creation with the same number that seals an oath? If this exploration gave you something worth thinking about, the other videos on this channel continue in the same spirit. Unhurried, curious, and taking the text seriously. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share for more videos like this.